I'm going to share our screen. Air age comes to Smithfield. This is an article by Sig Kofer de Shiel, and we are live. I'm back about an event that happened in May 8th of 1918 when the first aircraft came over and landed in Smithfield, Virginia, in Isle of Wight County. We'll start off by just reading from Sig's article. Like the rest of the world, flying has been commonplace, and its citizens may be found at any time taking off for anywhere, from Cairo to Cathay. The air age has become old hat as the space age takes over. However, somewhat more than 100 years ago, Mrs. Eliza Cock of Smithfield, in a letter to a friend in Portsmouth, dated 1859, took a more skeptical view of flying. You've doubtless read the account of the aerial voyage of the balloon Atlantic from St. Louis, she wrote. What do you think of it? I do not myself believe the air will ever be navigated for any practical use. Scientific men may occasionally succeed and raise the wonder and expectation of man. It involves too great an expenditure of money and risk to life. They thought they were going to cross the Atlantic at least, maybe circumnavigate. Who knows what they were thinking, but they made it in that area. Still a pretty good travel for that time period. One can hardly blame Mrs. Cock for being such a poor prognosticator. In an age when the steam engine was in its infancy and vessel and stagecoach were still popular means of travel, even a Jules Verne or an H.G. Wells might have balked at imagining what has come to pass. 60 years later, by World War I, Smithfield, unselfconsciously enjoying its last few days of isolation, had progressed as far as the steamboat and the Model T. But an airship was still a great thing to marvel at. One was glimpsed occasionally at a great distance, but seen chiefly by those sophisticates who visited the State Fair in Richmond, where barnstormers sometimes performed. Few people had ever seen one take off. So when word got around town on the morning of May 8th, 1918, that a plane from Langley Field was coming over and landing in the local ball diamond, it's not surprising that the town lost its collective head. All morning, the school children, the old frame schoolhouse on Institute Street, were excited and restless like a herd of steers at the approach of a thunderstorm. And the principal, trying to ride herd on them, announced sternly and unequivocally that this was no holiday and that no one would be allowed to leave the building when it came over. Nevertheless, when a roar of a motor was heard in the distance, the stampede was on. The whole student body rose up with one accord and without a by your leave made for the nearest exit, followed by all of the teachers and the principal. In the street, they fell in practically the entire population. Banks and stores, for whatever thieves there might have been, had joined the bankers, merchants, and customers and were headed for the ballpark. Mama snatched up their babies and took off. Those in the midst of morning baths grabbed whatever covering came to hand and dashed out. Young and old, all hell-bent to get there in time to see that airplane land. Cut at the end of Institute Street and rushed like the Gadarene swine headlong down a steep wood cropper, then up the hill on the far side. At the top of a stout barbed wire fence made formidable barrier, and one gallant gentleman stooped there, thinking the ladies' services were not called for. The young and agile wriggled through or under, and the not so young and not so agile sat themselves squarely on the sharp barbs without the slightest twinge, whirled their feet to the other side, and were off at a gallop. Mamas tossed their babies and scooped them up in passing without even breaking a stride. Meanwhile, an open Model T bearing Colonel J.W. Holloway, waving a huge United States flag, had arrived at the ballpark to show the pilot where to land. But each time the plane made a designated field, the whole crowd surged forward right under it. The pilot would circle and come on again, but again the crowd would beat him to it. Whichever way he went, they always got there first. Colonel Holloway rushed this way and that and waved his flag valiantly in an effort to point out but the crowd took it as just a fine patriotic gesture and followed with great enthusiasm. Finally, in a desperation, and rather than wipe out half the population with one swoop, the pilot picked out a likely-looking field across a road and a couple of fences and made a landing in Luster Thomas's cow pasture, just two pursuers. The ground was soft and the plane tipped over on its nose and snapped off the propeller. The two occupants unhooked their safety belts and plopped headfirst onto the ground and into the midst of the ecstatic welcome. The lady who fainted was revived and sent home in a Model T. The one who managed to get herself wedged horizontally in a narrow ditch was pried out and set on her feet again. Broken shoe heels, dropped hairpins, and side combs were salvaged. Lost shoes and misplaced children were hunted for, and matrons, chagrined to find themselves scrambling over fences and racing with abandon over cow pastures, gathered up shreds of dignity as they had left, and all made their way back to town. The lady who, in her haste to get there, had ridden out in the back of a truck with 9 strangers, thanked them kindly and returned on foot. The county sheriff was subsequently laid up for 3 weeks from having scrambled through a patch of poison ivy en route. The air age had come to Smithfield. And here's a photo of a similar Jenny from the Military Aviation Museum in Chesapeake, Virginia, flying just a few years ago. This photo is from Sig Kofer de Shiel's book and shows the airplane after it landed with the, if you look closely, you can see the propeller has been snapped off. The wheels are kind of burrowed in on one side. The rest of the plane seems to be in pretty good shape. It's back on its tail and main landing gear. And folks are, it's been roped off. The folks are wandering around, taking a look at it. More folks taking a look at the air show. Here's the airship. Here's a little bit better shot of the splintered prop there up on the front of the aircraft, and people just going about their normal day. And Smithfield aircraft came in. We're not for sure if this aircraft is still exists out there. Number 38101. If someone happens to have some Jennies sitting around them in their backyard. Back to Sig's story, a new propeller and 2 or 3 mechanics from Langley Field were sent over on the steamboat that evening. The plane took off next morning with a large and enthusiastic, but more manageable and already more knowing crowd looked on. Here's the little steamboat Onisha that was brought the mail and potentially the propeller and mechanics over from Langley. There were good communications back in the day. There's actually a telephone line in Smithfield where the ham and peanut plants could get the orders sent in, take orders, get things. If there are those born after World War I who feel inclined to scoff and laugh at the reactions of an earlier and less know-it-all generation, let them ponder for a minute this simple question. How are you, who have grown up seeing everything, know about to land in Luter Thomas's cow pasture? So that's the end of Sig's story. And here's a few more photos of the Curtiss Jan 4 Jenny taken off at that aircraft that belongs to the Military Aviation Museum. For those familiar with the aircraft, Langley Field had been established, and there was an aerial reconnaissance school there. So they probably needed lots of places to go out and fly around and take pictures of. Smithfield itself wouldn't have been a bad spot to take photos. There was a water tower, marks, pretty relatively easy town to find, following the river and the creek on the way over here. And we believe that Colonel Patterson of Langley Field coordinated with Colonel Holloway to set this up, and it all tied into a war saving stamp tour. Here's some of the clothes the folks would have been wearing in the time as they jumped over the fences and raced across cow pastures to see the airplane coming in and landing there in Smithfield. Curtiss JN4D, called the Jenny, its primary function was as an aircraft trainer for the armed services. We didn't have an Air Force at the time. It was the Army Air Service. And then right after the war, these aircraft were plentiful and available for other airmail services and barnstorming. It's a single engine, 2-seat biplane. It's got a wooden frame with the fabric covering. You can see some of the details on the wingtip out here, including the little handhold with the ground crews could use to help maneuver the aircraft around on the ground when it not in the air, when it was muddy at some of the fields. So not very many places had paved runways at the time. Engine was a 90 horsepower Curtiss OX5, a V8 piston engine. This aircraft is the one that we saw the picture of flying, the modern current day flying in this year in the hangar over at the Military Aviation Museum in Chesapeake. So it's pretty easy for the mechanic to get to it and work on the motor, and I kind of like the leather straps holding down the cowling. So it's kind of a stick and string. You've got the open wires. You've got a lot of exposed structural components, but you've got a 8-foot, 4-inch propeller made out of oak laminate, copper tipped, and it spun up to about 2,000 RPM. And it was obviously fixed pitch propeller, so your speed and your was controlled by RPM of the prop. Landing gear, not much bigger than the tires you find on a modern day bicycle, some of the fat bike tires out there. The rear cockpit in the airplane, just some simple gauges. You have a clock, and you have a altimeter and your airspeed, and you have your on-off switch for the motor over on the left side there. Simple stick and simple rudder pedals. That the magneto controls on the left side of the aircraft. Here's the fuel gauge. Desk up in the front of it. Got your height gauge, your RPM, airspeed, some of your oil temperature, voltage. You flew with the radio in this for modern day usage. Not just Curtiss, but other airplanes. It's really considered to be one of the most important aircraft of the early 20th century, with most of our pilots getting training in this aircraft, and also helped build American civil aviation at the time when they started designing these kinds of aircraft. There are thousands of other European aircraft, and just not very many that had actually been built and flown and become useful as trainers in the United States, except for a few that the Wright brothers had developed. Curtiss also liked dealing with motorcycles. Maximum speed of this aircraft was 75 miles, 1,000 feet, and you could carry a little over 2 hours of fuel on board. Langley Field was home for the School of Aerial Photography. Biplanes there, they trained pilots also, and was developed the early aerial photography. A lot of the early air combat techniques were developed and trained there. Crucial spot for training pilots back in the day. And field, this is a whole new field to the military at the time. So Langley was leading the charge in that regard. The whole setup of how the field was found, where they found the location and sent folks out to look at it, was kind of funny. The government thought they could send out people in civilian clothes to scout locations and not have the local landowners and realtors get a clue that what they were there looking for. But they did purchase set up the field itself. Captain McKinney was potentially one of the pilots that came over that day. We can't. Was in charge of one of the squadrons on the field there. They experimented with early aerial camouflage and made up a new word. The little McKean locomotive that was used over at the field to move supplies around on the airport. Right about this same time frame, just going to be 2 days from now, anniversary of when the first airmail began. some folks may be familiar that came out, and so it's very very valuable one. Let us know. It's worth a lot of money. And I guess one of the things some people, or we learned in the process of doing this presentation, the aircraft was printed correctly. It's the border around it that was printed upside down. So here's a little map, aerial flight rules aerial chart coming from Langley Field up on the top right there. Modern day over to Smithfield. They would have crossed over Newport News and seen the shipyard off to their left, and would not have seen the James River. Not there yet. Could have come across. It would have been pretty easy to pick out Pagan Creek coming off the James River, and the little town of Smithfield there as they on their way. It's always kind of been a visual reporting point. That's what I plotted it out with our navigation log. They would have flown about a magnetic heading of 239 degrees. On our way here, it was 14 miles. And if they're flying at about 60 knots, it would have taken them about 14 minutes. Winds on an average day like that out of the east at 15 would have given them a little bit of a tailwind, a little bit higher ground speed, potentially a little bit of left wind correction put in. So them fly heading at 235 degrees for 11 minutes, 48 seconds, and you should have Smithfield right under the front of your airplane. If you're burning, Jenny burns about 14 or so gallons per hour at 72% power setting and 24-30 RPM. So they would almost 3 gallons of gas on the way over here. Maybe a little more if this gentleman's hanging out the side, taking pictures along the way, creating extra drag as they head over, crossing the James River. So as we said, did they see the GRB on the is the creek that comes in? Nowadays it's called Pagan River, and towards an area where close to where the modern day Smithfield Library is. They could have potentially had this 1918 topography chart, or they may have been flying over taking pictures for the folks who were developing the chart at the time. But as we zoom in on the topo chart, we see Smithfield and also see Pagan Creek there. It's a creek back in the day, not a river. And seeing that we still had the steamboat routes running in and out of town. And they would have been looking. Here's a modern day look at Smithfield, and like say in the vicinity of those familiar with and is now the modern day Smithfield Library, the Blackwater Regional Library branch. This date on this is about pretty close to, I think it's 1930 time frame. And on the kind of the top left of where the town area even looks like the ball field there is one of the areas they have mentioned. It says built by the Smithfield Water Company around 1900. It's a good landmark. And if you well, you have to freeze this and go back and zoom in later, but it does show up on that aerial photo. Here's a little bit better shot of it. This is the vicinity of town they would have been. Here's close up at the propeller that they shattered, similar to this, that the tip was broken off the end of it. And back in the days with the grass fields, it's just kind of a skid on the tail there. So they didn't spend a lot of time on hard surfaces. They were part of a war-saving stamp tour is why they were flying around, landed in pastures. So here's the newspaper article. The Smithfield residents, the airplane was sent over from Langley Field by Colonel Patterson, the air to Hampton, where the aviator delivered the ham to Colonel Clayton. Smithfield ham has been sought in many ways. Its fame spread by air was a new venture. There's a couple more articles that you can pause this and take a look at it. Colonel Holloway was arranging flying machines. It came by Smithfield And also, we're going to swing by Windsor over the period of 2 or 3 days. Quite a bit of money was raised as part of the stamp tour. It says 5,000 people gathered in Smithfield, more than 2,000 in Windsor. This first flight where the airplane nosed over was kind of a reconnaissance flight to look for landing spots, and back a few days later. It says an aviator on the Delk farm near Smithfield, and after a series of daring stunts, and then proceeded on scheduled time over to Windsor. This, I think some of these tours put Smithfield on the map. So then by Labor Day of that same year, 1918, you had entire groups of soldiers coming over from both Langley and Fort Eustis to spend the weekend in town, and even gathered enough people together for 1918. That's the rest of the story. It's been a fun story to read from SIG, and here's some of the references we use putting the president. And if you got any more questions, feel free to put in the comments or check with us, and we can, and you have more things to add to the story, let us know. Thanks for watching. Y'all have a great day.